flip over this one? Or?
No, you're good.
Okay. All right.
Ready? Go.
Sample interview questions for the teacher. Why is art history important?
So the main answer I give when I'm asked that is because we live in a very visual world and we are surrounded by images, whether we're scrolling on our phones, driving down the street, or just in our own houses. And what art history enables you to do is read images. So we're working to get a sense of visual literacy. How do we read an image like we read a book? And the main thing I hope that my students get from my class is when they leave, they can use the skills they've developed in art history to understand the world around them in general. It doesn't have to be a work of art. It can be any image that they come across.
Beautiful. How do you see art shaping students' personality?
Well, a lot of my students are studio art majors, and so I know that they utilize the ideas and techniques that we talk about in art history in their own works, and they can use that to express themselves as their own form of self-expression. But also, I think what it enables the students to do is see themselves in people from other cultures and people from the past. Because when we look at a work of art, there's usually a way to connect to it somehow, and that's often an unexpected connection. And I see that hopefully making students more open-minded because they realize they have more in common with other people than there are differences from others.
Beautiful.
One
Can-
question. Hold on. Try that again.
Beautiful. Can you share a powerful moment that happened in this class?
So the one that immediately comes to mind for me actually happened outside of class. It was in office hours. And I had a student who came to me because they are working on creating a science fiction fantasy story and kind of their own graphic novel. And they, in developing the different cultures and peoples within this world they're creating, they wanted to know what kinds of architecture those people would build based on art historical evidence. So we got to sit together and talk about these different types of beings that the student had created and discuss, based on what we've learned of architectural history, what the architecture of these groups might look like based on their culture and how they lived and their morals. And they were actually able to design some of the worlds for their characters based on artworks and architecture we'd talked about before.
Interesting. Do you think art still holds up the same power today as it did 100 years ago?
I think it does, but I think the type of power art has shifted in some ways. When you study art history, one of the big themes, despite the time period or the culture, the location you're studying, is that art has often been a way of showcasing power and importance and wealth. And today, we live in a world where art is incredibly accessible. So our access to art through things like the internet, galleries, and museums, that in some ways changes the power of art because it is something that is not just available to those with wealth and with political importance or social importance. It is more available to everyone. So I think art is just as important as it was before, but that power has changed as society has shifted.
So it's safe to say once anything or any entity is put into the hands of only a specific kind of group, you're only going to get influence from that narrative, from that perspective. But once you give everybody the equal playing ground opportunity, you'll get a plethora of art that comes out from that. And that way it'll change from being, like you said, like a social status, and now it becomes more of an expression of the lens of the world that I view and how I'm looking at things.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you're looking at the ancient world into, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the people who were commissioning works of art were people with power. They were rulers, they were high-ranking members of the religious faith, they were nobles, and they were generally commissioning objects that helped them to maintain their power and maintain the current social order. And today, because we have more access to what we need to create art in some ways, the materials are in some ways more available to us, they're less costly, you start to see other viewpoints depicted in works of art. So we're seeing more ideas from a greater variety of people than you did historically.
That's very interesting as well, because I know for sure it's almost like when you get a gun, gun is neutral. Like anything is neutral. It all depends on what the hands that it falls in is what it's going to be used for. Has art before being used to create a narrative so they can control and lead a certain kind of people to a certain destination versus now, since it's in the hands of everybody, it's uncontrollable?
Well, I think people do still try to use art in that way. There's a lot of art that we could define as propaganda. It's meant to show someone's power, establish why they have that power, and keep them in control of that power. We still see that in works of art and in visual culture. But I think because we have access to more works of art, we are more perhaps aware of those techniques of showing power, and we may be more cynical and we may be more prone to questioning them. But one of the most common types of art, if you're looking specifically at the ancient world, is portraits of rulers. And we often talk about in my classes how we can't really trust those portraits as an accurate representation of who that ruler is, because the goal of the object was to show their power. So it would often make them look stronger, more beautiful, wealthier, more perfect than they actually were. So when we say portrait, we assume it's telling us what someone looked like. But really what portraits historically have done is told you what that person wants us to know about them, whether or not that is the truth or if it's an idealized version of themselves.
That's interesting, and I just caught something that you just said. The rulers who have the control over it, they got control over the people who are also viewing it. So once it becomes into the hand of the average person, guess what? The average person can now use that art to expose what's been going on prior to them actually having access to it. Because I see a huge jump in revolutionary art. Like art to just define how to like fight the power, control, like get a break free from the system and that kind of art like that. So what's your take on how art has been used now versus how it was prior when it was only confined to a certain group?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that's impacted that, if we kind of stay with this example of portraiture, in the ancient world, prior to the 19th century, you didn't have cameras, you didn't have photography. So what you saw to represent someone was a painting of them, and that is a subjective object. Whereas photography, you are still making decisions as a photographer, and you can still edit, but it is in some ways a more objective medium. And now that we have access to those kinds of technologies, whether it's photography or film, we can actually compare what's being presented to us in a work of art to what is actually happening. And that idea of using art as something revolutionary, that's something that's existed for a really long time, but the place my mind immediately goes is in the 19th century in France. You have a movement called realism, in which artists decided, one of the artists was Gustave Courbet, and he decided, I'm only going to paint things I actually see with my own two eyes. And he started showing images of the lower class, people who were performing manual labor. And historically, those were people who were not depicted in works of art. Rulers didn't commission a painting of two men breaking stones on the side of the road. But Courbet said, no, these people are just as important as rulers, and they should be shown. His work was not very popular when he started doing that. But you do really see, especially in the 19th century, a shift in what the goal of art is. You sort of see a self-awareness that art has historically been for the elites, and it was made by them, it was paid for, and it was to keep them in power. And then you start to see artists very consciously questioning that role of art.
Amen. What's your take on AI and its impact on art?
I understand the concerns about AI. It could certainly be taking jobs away from artists. I also think that every time there is a new technology, we tend to have a panic about it. The same thing happened when cameras were invented. Painters were like, painting is dead. We have cameras out. No one's going to want a painting anymore. And that didn't happen. People still wanted paintings. We still want paintings today. So I think it's just going to be a question of how we see artists adapting to this new technology. How do artists utilize AI within their process? Similar to how we saw painters begin to enjoy the use of a camera as a resource, taking photographs of what you wanted to paint, taking those photographs into your studio and using them as a reference for your subject matter. And I think we'll likely see more and more artists using AI in that way.
That's a beautiful way of looking at it, because there always has been big scares when, like you said, when new technology comes out. but in some way, somehow, you can, it's awfully duplicated, but just never replicated.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? And I think AI is going to be another one of those things to where, yeah, it'd be a nice, cool, fun tool to use, but you're never going to take away the anointing from a human being with an artistic gift.
Yeah. There's definitely something to be said for the hand of the artist and how the hand of the artist comes through in the work, whether that's through an emotional impact or whether that's through seeing the brush strokes or the fingerprints in a work of sculpture. You really can't overestimate the power that that has.
Amen. Well, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.